Welcome to The Exchange with KB with your host, Kirill Bensonoff. Kirill talks to innovators and business leaders who share interesting stories of their success, overcoming challenges, and actionable advice you can learn from. Visit KirillBensonoff.com and sign up for updates. Joining Kirill today is Patrick South, who is Vice President of Development for the Chamber of Digital Commerce. Prior to joining the Chamber, he was the blockchain practice lead at Accenture Federal Services. South has spent the majority of his career focused on the defense sector and intelligence community, and has experience operating across the renewable energy and satellite imagery industries and more. And now, here's your host, KB.
Hey, Patrick, welcome to the show.
Kirill, thanks for having me on. Big fan of the show.
Awesome, man. Thanks so much. Let me start out. Would you mind telling us a bit about yourself, like where you went to school, where you grew up, just a little bit of the background?
Yeah, happily. I grew up right outside of Washington, D.C. in the Northern Virginia area. I've been here for 20 some years at this point. Went to school here. After high school, I kind of took a non-traditional journey. Instead of going off to a four-year college, I started consulting. I was doing renewable energy consulting at the time. I took some community college classes at night. The traditional educational route just didn't align with kind of my preferred learning path, which is through immersive experiences. And so I grew my career in consulting, eventually joined a firm called Accenture, and kind of pivoted from renewable energy to technology consulting. In kind of my career path elevated or escalated from there. I ended up as a forcing function. I needed to get a four-year degree at some point in my career. And at the time, I was flying back and forth to Denver, helping a company launch a commercial imagery satellite. And in order to kind of be billed at a certain rate, I needed to have a four-year degree as part of that qualification. Mm-hmm. I went online to University of Phoenix and wrapped up there for 2 years while I was flying back and forth on Sundays and Thursdays. So that was interesting, but non-traditional route. And so I really appreciate a slight tangent here, but really appreciate what some of the folks over at Lambda School are doing these days in terms of kind of the idea of presenting ISAs to individuals is alternative educational routes.
Yeah, that's awesome. I'd love to chat about that a little bit more because I have some interest in sort of the non-traditional education as well. So, and I see you got like a bunch of certifications, AWS. So you're working with AWS Cloud. Is that how you like morphed into the technology space?
Yeah. So when I moved over to Accenture, the first project I was working on was helping to manage a 20,000 square foot data center in the defense and intelligence community here in DC. And I started doing program and project management activities, but my passion is really in technology. Growing up, I liked tinkering and building computers. We'd go to friends' houses and have LAN parties and play Counter-Strike. And so being immersed in that environment, I really wanted to kind of get more into the technical realm. So I pivoted from true program and project management over to technical project management. And so I was managing, what we were providing was an infrastructure service platform, an ISP for application service providers to build on top of. So we had an IaaS model. We pivoted more to a PaaS model over time. And in that, I got to play around with hyper-converged infrastructure like Nutanix, build out. At the time, private cloud was all the rage. So we were building on AWS and Azure. And then over time, we as you saw, kind of most of industry pivot from private to public cloud. Then got to build on varying AWS clouds.
Yeah, interesting. And can you tell us how you got into crypto or how you heard about cryptocurrency or whatever you heard about first?
Yes. So my journey there is a little interesting. I don't want to out anyone. Someone very close to me was using Bitcoin to purchase weed at the time.
That's great, man.
And I love this person dearly, and so I was like, you know what, I got to figure out what you're doing and what all this rage is. And this is probably 2013, Yeah, it was probably 2013, 2014. And so I researched it. I was like, you know what, that's pretty neat. But it didn't click for me right away. And probably a year and a half later, my roommate at the time kind of brought it up as well, and just was infatuated by it. So I said, you know what, there's just too many people telling me about this. I need to look into it. So like most, read through the white paper again. For me, it didn't immediately click, but it did catch my attention. And so from there, I dove into Twitter and Reddit and everything else, and just began consuming mass amounts of information around it. And I was fully immersed, right? As people say, you kind of fall down the rabbit hole, and I was there.
Yeah.
Now my viewpoints have what I'll call matured or evolved over time. But it's just been an absolute blast. I mean, what I love about this space is for someone who's naturally intellectually curious, I mean, there's no shortage of information for you to learn about in the space. So it's very neat to see folks that are building the underlying infrastructure and the protocols. It's fun to see the varying adapts that are being built on top of it. There's a regulatory component, a legal component. There's an economics and game theory component on top of it. So I find it tough to know everything about the space. But again, there's just no shortage of learning opportunities, and that's what I enjoy most.
Yeah, I'd say it's next to impossible to know everything, because as you said, and you said it nicely, the space is comprised, and this is unusual probably for lots of other technology focus areas. Is that there is the regulatory, there is the game theory, there is financial, huge financial component to it. There is, the deep technology, the crypto, component to it itself. So, I mean, and I'm probably not naming all of them. I mean, there's so many aspects to blockchain / cryptocurrency that it's really hard to be an expert in all of them, but it's extremely interesting.
Yeah, and there's such divergent viewpoints in that it's a religious base. I mean, you can point to the obvious, Bitcoin versus Ethereum camps. And the other interesting piece, though, is you get folks who are just beyond passionate and hold completely divergent views on how they think the ecosystem is going to play out, right? Especially if you look at the idea of permission versus permissionless blockchains, or private versus public. I think there's a lack of understanding around terminology to date, and how folks are describing private or permission, public or permissionless, digital securities versus smart securities versus security tokens. I'm hoping that over time we get the vernacular more well established, so that we're kind of all talking about the same things in the right way. Now, it's okay to have divergent viewpoints, but I think nomenclature is holding us up to some degree as well. And so for those just like entering the journey, it can be a high barrier to entry, just figuring out what one person's telling you versus another person.
Definitely. Do you see any similarity between, you talked about the private and the public cloud, and how the shift in IT happens from private cloud to more of a public cloud infrastructure? Do you see any similarity with how the blockchain space is evolving? Maybe public blockchain versus permissioned, or just in general. I mean, I think that the cloud, if I remember, because I come from IT background as well, so I know a little bit about AWS and Azure and the public cloud providers as they were growing up. I think that I remember back in the day in 2006, I think when AWS came online, talking to people, I was like, I think this is the future, but mostly everybody was saying, no, it's not. This is too expensive. This is not secure, et cetera, et cetera. And now it's sort of like, who doesn't use AWS, right? Do you see any similarity there?
Yeah, so there are some extreme similarities, and then there's one major difference. So the similarities are, you're absolutely right. Early on, folks were hesitant to consume public cloud, primarily because the economies of scale didn't exist. There were extreme concerns around data segregation, right? So the idea that your data was going to be hosted on the same infrastructure, despite virtual separation, that there were still some issues. People really wanted physical separation of their infrastructure. And over time, right, primarily because of economies of scale and the price points that they'd be able to access it at, along with enhanced security, and broader social proof, right? There were other folks that took that bet, and therefore they're willing to go to their leadership and place a similar bet because of the price point that they're able to garner. We saw that paradigm shift. Now, the major so all of that I think we'll continue to see play out. Right now, we're looking at some of the issues in permissionless blockchains around scalability, around data segregation, around, we'll call it zero knowledge proofs and multi-party computation. As we start to see these things not only scale but mature, I think we'll begin to see larger industry players place bets on the permissionless side of the house. The major difference is when they move from private to public cloud, they're still able to point the finger at AWS at the end of the day, right? There's still a major player there, and they're falling under AWS or Microsoft's umbrella. And so there's still someone to hold liable when something goes wrong. The major difference in my mind between permissioned and permissionless blockchains is in a permissioned ecosystem, you've built consortia, you've established legal contracts around it. There's hard governance that speaks to dispute resolution and onboarding and offboarding procedures. So there's that safety net that people have on if something goes wrong, there's a legal construct defined within our governance that we're going to be able to point the finger and we'll have the correct remediative action. Now, as soon as you take that jump into the permissionless realm, AWS isn't there anymore. Microsoft isn't necessarily there anymore. So I think there's just greater concern at that point where you're really trusting code more than an individual entity.
This is absolutely true, but in some ways, wouldn't you say that code is probably more trustworthy than a centralized entity?
So I have a feeling you and I aren't the ones that need convincing on this. But yeah. I totally agree with you.
Yeah.
I think it's educating organizations on really what this enables and why they should place that bet. That's the important job that folks are out there on the ground doing today.
Definitely. So that brings us to your next adventure. So you're currently at the Chamber of Digital Commerce. I'd love to hear, and I'm sure everyone out there does as well, I'd love to hear just at a high level, what does the Chamber do and kind of, what's its mission and values and that kind of stuff?
Yeah. So our mission is to promote the acceptance and use of digital assets and blockchain-based technologies. It's a broad mission set, and our membership base reflects that. So we've been around for about 5 years now, and in blockchain years, that's a couple lifetimes over. Into what we have is we've established a membership base of over 200 members. Our membership is a bit bifurcated. 60% of those represent startups or the true pioneers in the space. And those vary from cryptocurrency platforms to crypto exchanges to analysis entities, right? Folks doing data analysis in the space, to folks that operate in the security token landscape, whether they're issuance platforms or ATSs. And the other 40% represent large financial institutions, IT consultancies, service providers, law firms, and accounting and advisory firms. And what that enables us to do is to have a pretty prolific platform in which we engage with regulators globally. The regulators we engage with here in the States are folks like SEC, CFTC, FINRA, in CFPB and others, as well as we engage with Congress, primarily through the Congressional Blockchain Caucus, and then the Executive Office. And we do all that to align to our mission set. So we've taken on a number of key policy issues that our members engage with us on, and they do that through a series of working groups that we have. So kind of the key topics that we're tackling right now are around the treatment of tokens, and some guidelines on what are utility or non-security tokens versus what are security tokens. AML, so anti-money laundering. There's some major concerns that we have in the space today. And then the third piece is we've established a national action plan for blockchain. There's a ton of regulatory uncertainty in the United States. And what we're seeing that lead to is a fair amount of global regulatory arbitrage. So we're seeing companies pick up and go to other regulatory jurisdictions, primarily in Asia. The growth in Hong Kong and Singapore has been unbelievable. We're also seeing some growth in smaller jurisdictions like Malta, Gibraltar, Bermuda, and other places.
Sure.
And so our argument is one of the U.S. government around economic development, in which we feel like the United States is losing out on innovation and investment in this space. And we simply want statements of support from the U.S. government that speaks to the promotional nature of this, to promote the technology and speaks to the innovation and investment potential.
So do you guys actually lobby on behalf of your members? Are you like a registered lobby firm?
Yeah, good question. So yes, some folks within the chamber are registered as lobbyists. Not everyone is.
Gotcha. Okay. And so you guys are, as you said before, based in DC. So you're, I imagine, well connected and kind of immersed into the government goings on. Am I correct?
Oh yeah. So we've been very intentional about kind of who we brought on board in the chamber, as well as some other folks that consult with us. So our Token Alliance, for instance, is co-chaired by former SEC Commissioner Paul Atkins and former CFTC Chairman Jim Newsom. Our Chief Policy Officer, Amy Kim, is a Bank Secrecy Act expert. So her background is in OFAC sanctions and AML compliance. So we've brought together a unique group of folks who have existing relationships in the space, as well as kind of institutional equity or domain knowledge in a variety of the key areas that blockchain and crypto are touching on today. To point back to the earlier part of our conversation, there are just so many tentacles, if you will, that blockchain and crypto touch, that we've tried to establish a well-rounded team who's really able to touch on each of those key issues.
For sure. And just because there's so many things I want to ask you about, but let's start at a high level. I mean, what do you hear and feel, I guess, at currently in DC? I mean, is blockchain and crypto, is that sort of still top of mind? I mean, obviously we had, 2017 when Bitcoin and other cryptocurrency prices were going through the roof. Then we had the 2018 crypto winter, and now we're in maybe the spring, who knows? But there's a lot less attention, I feel like, on the price of the cryptocurrency, and maybe more attention is shifted to, is blockchain and the protocol, the code-based economy, the right way to go, with the technology behind it. So, I mean, is it still top of mind in DC, or is it kind of faded into the background?
No. So I certainly think it's top of mind. One way that I measure, right, how top of mind it is if you just look at how people are allocating their time and energy, right? And if you look at over the past couple of weeks, we've seen some of the major regulatory players in the space attending a variety of blockchain and crypto related events, right, to get out and speak. And so there's some really wonderful proponents in the space. You look at folks like John Carlo, right, CFTC chairman, or Hester Peirce, SEC commissioner. I love that folks refer to them as crypto mom and crypto
yes,
dad, respectively. But so there's folks that are very enamored and kind of love what their viewpoint to the space. Now, unfortunately, not everyone feels the same way that each of them do. But we saw many regulators speak at New York Blockchain Week. Last week, we were out in San Francisco at an Andreessen Horowitz crypto regulatory event, and Bill Hinman was there, Kavita Jain from FINRA. We saw Val Shapanik from FinHub at the SEC, amongst others. Jessica Rainier from Treasury. And so seeing kind of these folks who are coming and attending these type of events and are voicing kind of their opinions, right, and not necessarily the opinions of the agency, but that's committing time and energy to continue to further the development and their understanding of this space, and as well as to inform and educate industry on how they can continue to operate within the boundaries of these regulatory authorities.
Sure.
So So strictly looking at how they're allocating their time and energy, I'd say yes, it is absolutely top of mind. This week, the SEC, the FinHub, is having their FinTech Forum on the 31st. That's here in Washington, D.C. It's first come, first serve for folks in the door. It starts at 9:30 a.m. Eastern, and they've got a packed agenda that is solely focused. I think I can say it's solely focused. Yeah, it is. It's solely focused on what we'll just call distributed ledger technology and digital assets.
I think that, based on what I'm seeing and not sitting in the hub, of it all in DC, but kind of reading the news, it seems that back in maybe 2017, the SEC commissioner came out and said that SEC is not interested in shutting down the space, and they're not interested in stifling innovation and using all those keywords. Yet after that, they turn around and, they shut down some companies, and they go after, to me, like they went after what seemed like small fish, like the Ether Delta exchange and this token lot, which was their example of an unregistered broker dealer, which is like two guys in their, mid 20s or maybe 30, yet we still have like Coinbase and Kraken and everyone else with a lot of money operating in the US, seemingly without any repercussion. I mean, what is their true motive here? Do you know?
Yeah. So looking at those, right, and I certainly don't have a crystal ball or inside knowledge to any of this, but my simple guess would be when the SEC, there's kind of two things to point to, right? One is folks are actively looking at the SEC for guidance, and typically folks want got like issued guidance that will help to establish guidelines for them to play by. One of the things that Brad Garlinghouse said at our summit back in March was, we've been told not to speed, but we haven't been told what the speed limit is. And I think that's a good way of putting it. It's, if I'm on the highway, I'm going 65 miles an hour, I get pulled over. Okay, that's too fast. I'll slow down. I'm going 45. I get pulled over again, get a ticket. Okay, well, that's still too fast. Well, now if I decide to go 15 miles an hour, right, I'm going to end up hampering innovation to some degree because I don't know what the highest threshold of the speed limit is that I'm able to obtain, and therefore, I'm going to have other folks either domestically or internationally that are able to pass me by via innovation because I'm hampered by not having true guidance. What we have been receiving is some level of guidance through enforcement, which is exactly what you're alluding to. Now, if I was the SEC, when I'd be choosing what cases I'd be enforcing, right, they're probably ones that I believe I have a good chance of winning. And so some of the larger entities that you mentioned, if
they're lawyered up
to this, but yeah, that's just not a bet that they may want to place right now, given some of those firms may be willing to fight versus ones that they think are going to fold, and that's just an opportunity for them to issue guidance through enforcement on that was outside the line.
Sure, no, it makes sense in some way. It's just kind of intuitive a little bit to what I hear some of the folks say. And do you think that the SEC just reminds us all the time that they're there to enforce regulation. They don't make the rules, they just enforce them, et cetera, et cetera. And that may be well and true. So do you think that it'll take an act of Congress to change the current securities regulation, or will it be, or are we going to continue along with the laws written in the 30s and the 40s and kind of make little exemptions?
Yeah. So again, I got to say, the SEC's got a tough job. This is just one piece of crypto is just really one piece of their overall purview.
A small piece we should add.
Yeah, absolutely. That said, they're there to protect against information asymmetry. So they're not there to innovate. It's industry's job to innovate, and they're there to really enforce their mission set and again protect against information asymmetries. So in that, industry obviously has 33, 34, 40 Act to kind of obey within. I don't think we're going to see in the next year and a half or 2 years, I don't think we're going to see the meaningful guidance that industry is looking for come out of the SEC in the way that industry wants it to. So to your broader question on, is it going to take a congressional act? It could. I don't think that the majority of industry understands how difficult that is to occur, and that's typically when other industries are approaching this, that's typically an act of last resort, just because of how difficult that is to actually influence and shape in the way that turns out to be as meaningful as the industry wants it to be. Is it an option? Absolutely. I think that there are probably some other ways that we could end up influencing this without having to go the congressional route. That said, we love what's going on in Congress right now. The folks that are leading the Congressional Blockchain Caucus are really great representatives, and have made an effort not only to get themselves educated, but their staff educated on what some of the key issues are that industry is facing. And we've seen some folks put a foot forward in trying to really help further the space.
Sure.
The National Action Plan for Blockchain that I referenced is really where our head is at right now in terms of trying to elevate the conversation to the executive office, and really escalate it to the same level of conversation that 5G, AI, and quantum are being had. So if we can get that top-down narrative, we think that will help to really open the gates for true guidance from regulatory agencies to align to executive thoughts.
Sure. So if somebody, if one of the listeners is thinking about, I have an idea for a blockchain company, and it might involve a token or a cryptocurrency in some shape or form in order to power the network or what have you, and I live in the United States. I mean, what are they to do? Or should they continue to pursue and think about how they do it within the current regulation, do like an accredited investor Reg D type of an offering and thus, exclude 95 or 98% of the population? Should they think about going outside the US and establishing a base of operations in Asia or in the Cayman Islands or whatever it may be? What should people be doing right now?
I am definitely not one to consult on legal advice. So I'd say if someone was thinking of doing that, my first recommendation would be to talk to a number of the phenomenal lawyers that exist in the space on and what some of their recommendations would be.
And there is some, let me just interrupt for a sec. There's some really great firms listed on the digitalchamber.org website that I'm sure are all very familiar with the space.
You're doing my job for me now. I appreciate that. There certainly are. So digitalchamber.org, we've got a number of them listed. If you'd like to get in contact with any, I'm Patrick at digitalchamber.org and can happily help. That said, you listed a couple of the options, right? You can go through traditional capital formation. You can go through like the Reg D, Reg S route if you want. We've seen some entities that are now trying to go down the Reg A plus route. Blockstack was kind of the most recent. And that will eventually, right, when we see a Reg A plus approval, that will kind of open the door, hopefully, to more that can come through the gates, where we're able to provide access to not only accredited but also unaccredited investors in the space. And I think that's meaningful. The other thing that Kirill, you typically hear when folks are asking these type of questions is they start to look at the definition of an accredited investor, and would it be some type of implementing a sophistication test or something like that to change how we define an accredited investor versus the decades-old accredited investor, quote-unquote, test that we have today.
Absolutely.
You can also look at going to excluding the U.S., and we've seen a number of folks do that to go outside to other jurisdictions. Ultimately, there's kind of a broader question of we saw an inordinate amount of capital raised for some of these projects. And there's a question of, do you need that much capital to really build what was outlined in your white paper or otherwise? And so in terms of hampering innovation, if someone has an idea in this space, I mean, there are a ton of different ways that someone can go about executing that idea through existing accelerators and other programs that exist today, where folks are are able and willing to deploy capital in very traditional means to help you achieve that. And so I encourage folks to evaluate all of the existing options that individuals have been exploring prior to ruling out the United States as well.
Sure. No, I agree with you 100%. I mean, I think there's still a ton of options, right? We have, U.S. has a very robust investment community in the process, starting with accelerators and VCs and angels and all of that stuff. That's all in place, more so than ever before, I believe. Then we also have a bunch of other options like crowdfunding right now, where you could do crowdfund under Reg CF, and that's up to, it's a small amount of money, but that's perhaps enough to get started. So there's a ton of options out there. I want to talk about something else for a second. What really scares me about the space right now, and I think you touched on it a second, a little bit earlier, is this anti-money laundering stuff that's, I believe, kind of top of mind discussions in some agencies and organizations. So I read recently that there's going to be some new rules coming out around AML, and that those rules might really hamper the way that exchanges and other blockchain-based economies operate today. Am I onto something here? Are you familiar with this?
Yeah. So there have been a couple things that have occurred recently. So one is, and this has been talked for a lot of people, is the UN has something called the Financial Action Task Force, which is abbreviated as FATF. And they issued an interpretive note to what they called Recommendation 15, and then held some private sector events recently. And in that, there's some really concerning considerations that they have for what they're calling virtual asset service providers and how they're defining those individuals. We also saw FinCEN provide guidance recently that makes reference to the fact that FinCEN believes that virtual currency exchangers and administrators that are money services businesses, or MSBs, are subject to the funds transfer rule and the funds travel rule, which is the U.S. implementation of the FATF recommendation, which means that if you're operating in the United States, which requires the MSB to obtain certain identifying information about their customer and parties involved in the transaction, including the originator of the transaction and the recipient, whether or not that originator or recipient is the MSB's customer. So to kind of quickly break that down, if I'm an exchange, let's say I'm Coinbase, and Kirill, you have an account on Coinbase, right? And so let's say you have some Bitcoin that exists in your Bitcoin wallet, you've got some Ether that exists in your Ethereum wallet, and I'm Patrick, and I have kind of a personal Trezor that I maintain, and I want to send you $10 worth of Bitcoin. I can send you $10 worth of Bitcoin from my Trezor to your Coinbase address for your Bitcoin wallet. This new rule is essentially establishing is that Coinbase is going to be responsible for understanding who I am on the other end of that transaction, which, given the technology, just isn't necessarily possible today. There are plenty of analysis entities out there who kind of help to identify different addresses on varying blockchains, but some of that is just to a degree of certainty. I mean, how can Coinbase be liable if they're not doing KYC on me personally, but yet they've only done KYC on you, Kirill? And that is what we're viewing as something that we don't see as a positive sign for the industry. So we've put together a response letter with our members on what we think solutions may look like to this problem over time.
So let me just make sure I understand this correctly. So the proposed rules, and this is at an international level, am I right?
So FATF is at an international level. That's correct. So FATF helps to set international standards for anti-money laundering or AML. And then FinCEN then is placing these rules at the U.S. level. So right. They take in the FATF recommendation and they're applying that to what we call the funds travel rule. And sure. That's only for folks operating in the U.S.
And so the FATF is, I believe, made up of the G7 or G8 countries. Am I right?
Correct.
Okay. So then if, let's say they implement this recommendation, most likely most of the developed economies are most likely going to have to follow the recommendations in order for them to be accepted into the global financial community of money transfer community, right?
That's correct.
So, and what they're proposing, if I'm understanding correctly, is the idea that, let's say I have some Bitcoin or whatever cryptocurrency in my Trezor, and I'd like to send it to an exchange where, let's say you have your wallet, that the exchange would have to know who the money is coming from. Is that correct?
That's accurate.
Okay. And so, and this is not really possible today, right? Because, I mean, if I send Bitcoin, it doesn't come with any other information other than the fact that it was sent, right? And how much and et cetera. But that's it.
Exactly. There's not technology inherently built into, I'll say most, maybe any protocols today that allows you to block a transaction, right? And so that's always been a concern from an OFAC perspective also, and that you have OFAC sanctioned addresses in Iran and a couple other places in which if someone took from an OFAC sanctioned address, just decided to sprinkle a few Satoshis in some of the largest public addresses that exist on the Bitcoin blockchain, there's no way to block that transaction from an OFAC sanctioned address. So there's always been a compliance perspective of how to deal with that.
Yeah, and I think you're right. I think the difference is that there is some tools like Chainalysis and maybe other types of software that exists that can now at least trace that Bitcoin back to this potential blacklisted address. So if they send it to someone that uses Chainalysis, just to use as them as an example, then there is a way potentially to trace it back, right? And then maybe the owner of the wallet will have to send it back or close the wallet or what have you. Now, with the proposed rules that you're talking about, I mean, that stuff is not even possible to do at all today. And if they implement those rules, in my view, if they say tomorrow, Coinbase has to collect the information on the sender of the funds as well as who it's going to, which they already have, that would make it impossible for them to operate. Am I right?
Yeah, you're absolutely right.
And that's really scary to me.
It's scary to a lot of people, Kirill.
Yeah. And because I remember, maybe a year or so ago, I have an attorney, a friend of mine, and she said that she wasn't that scared of whatever's going on in Congress, so that they may or may not change the securities regulations or the definition of where the virtual currency may fall, whether it's a commodity or a security or something else. She wasn't as scared of that. And she told me that she was really scared of this anti-money laundering kind of getting out of control a little bit and saying that, things like this could happen. And it looks like is there a chance that it may happen, or is it kind of far off?
No, there is absolutely a chance this may happen. We're under a bit of a short timeline in that. So right now the U.S. is in kind of a lead position of FATF, and that changes. I think it's at the end of June, and afterwards China takes over, and the U.S. is the one that's really pushing this forward right now. So we're on a short time frame in terms of how we'll really see this evolve. So we're acting quickly. We were in Vienna and in Austria with a number of our members. You mentioned Chainalysis, others like Elliptic and CipherTrace and several other companies were there also advocating on behalf of industry. And now we're working the necessary follow-up actions. The FATF will be briefing the G20 in Japan here shortly on what they want these guidelines to look like. And we're actively trying to ensure that our voice is heard throughout this.
And how are the other countries looking at this? I mean, you mentioned the U.S. The U.S. is driving it. First of all, it seems kind of counterintuitive that they're driving this at the international level, yet in the U.S., it doesn't seem like, there's that will to change the AML laws just in the U.S., right? So it seems like they're driving internationally, yet FinCEN doesn't seem to be, doing this here yet. But then how is the international community responding? Are they receptive to this, or are they saying, no way, this isn't good for us?
We've seen varying degrees of responses at this point. There appear to be some countries that are more in line with this, and others that aren't.
I see, and I think that with the current trade war between U.S. and China, if this doesn't happen, if the presidency of FATF doesn't get during the presidency, if this doesn't get resolved when China takes over, there's a chance that they may table this discussion just to kind of spite U.S.
Yeah, you know what? I am not a geopolitical expert, but I shouldn't say geopolitical. But I'm not a political expert. But I would. It wouldn't surprise me if that occurred.
Wow. So I mean, this is really the crux of what my friend told me a year ago, and it may actually be coming to a head now. So, I mean, I think this is like the number one thing, it seems to me, because the AML regulation is very strict. And if things like this were added to it, and this is international, I mean, there really wouldn't be a place, unless you're thinking about, really, really like off the grid places that don't participate in all these international regulation. It doesn't seem like there would be a place with an established banking system and all the other stuff where one could say, hey, I'm gonna do the regulatory arbitrage thing and establish a base of operation, on this small island here. That won't really work anymore, right?
Yeah, you are spot on. The other thing is, you referenced kind of the seriousness of AML, and the enforcement actions that take place through folks like FinCEN and others can be drastically different from some fines and a slap on the wrist that you may get through other regulatory agencies. So, I mean, we're definitely in the real ball game at this point.
Wow. Yeah. I think to me, this is like the big takeaway from our conversation today is the seriousness of what could be facing the industry. I mean, this is an existential threat. I mean, there's really no way to put it more lightly.
Yeah. I mean, the one shining light here is that they are interested in kind of industry solutions and coming together, and so that's what we're actively trying to do now, is to discuss the varying options that exist. Using X509 certificates or signed data, or varying other industry solutions to bring to the table that can help us to continue to push this forward in the right way. We think that those within Treasury are interested in considering options for achieving compliance with these rules objectives. We understand that their biggest concern is they just want to understand counterparties to a transaction. And so it's important for us to determine who's a financial institution, vice an individual, and where those rules should truly apply. So whether that's a whitelist or otherwise, I think there's some interesting ways for us to define this.
Sure. I mean, this is I'm truly hoping you guys are able to change their minds, and it sounds like you guys are actively working on this. So this is a piece of a good news, right? It's great that organizations like yours exist, and you guys are out there, speaking the voice of the industry. So for anyone who's listening, I think it's important that you're at least familiar with what is going on in the space now, and what kind of real big threats the space is facing today.
Yeah, thank you, Kirill.
No problem. So with this kind of a semi dour note, I'd like to move on to the lightning round.
Let's do it.
All right. BTC or ETH?
BTC.
Permissioned or public blockchains?
Public.
Is Craig Wright the real Satoshi?
Absolutely not.
Price of BTC on December 31st?
12.5.
Bitcoin ETF in 2019, yes or no?
No, I wish so.
All right, man. That's all we got for today. Patrick, thank you so much for coming on the show. This was so much fun and really educational for me. Everyone out there listening, check out Digital Chamber. At the website is digitalchamber.org, and we'll put up some links.
Thanks for having me, Kirill.
Thank you very much.